brothers and sisters, I believe that the amazing events, and I don't use that word lightly, the amazing events that have happened in the last 3 years, since 2016, are God's message to us that Christ is about to come. That's why it happens almost every day. Can you remember a time, go back 10 years, go back 20 years, can you remember a time, go back even to after 1967, can you ever remember a time when almost every day there's something highly significant happening in relation to fulfilling Bible prophecy? I can't. But it's been happening for the last 3 years, almost 3 years. It began with Brexit in June 2016. A few months later, the election of Donald Trump as the President of the United States of America. Did anybody expect either of those to happen? No. God did it. He did it because he wanted his purpose to be given some impetus. And that impetus has been happening for the last 3 years, brothers and sisters. And we know we're on the verge of the return of Christ. So, can you ever remember a time either when there's been so much anger in our world? Well, that too is a prophecy being fulfilled. In Revelation 11 verse 18 we read this, and I wanted to start with this passage because you see this has got to do with our theme for this week. We read this, "And the nations were angry, and thy wrath is come, and the time of the dead that they should be judged." The resurrection is at hand, brothers and sisters. I could sit down now, couldn't I? Because there's proof enough. In the anger that fills our world, in the domestic situations, in politics, in international affairs, you name it. Anger is everywhere, is it not? There's never been a time like this, so we know that it is the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that thou shouldest give reward unto thy servants the prophets, and to the saints, and to them that fear thy name, small and great, and shouldest destroy them which destroy the earth. And of course that word destroy there, thero, means to rot thoroughly. And that of course is happening, isn't it? Both in the physical arena, mankind is corrupting his environment, and God is even using that as part of the means of bringing to pass his purpose. And of course they have utterly corrupted human society when it comes to morality. So the time is coming when God is going to send his Son. We just read, brothers and sisters, from Ezekiel 38. How familiar is this passage of Scripture to us? You know, I've given many, many talks on Ezekiel 38 in the last 50 years. There's never been a time when I can speak about it like I can now. We are on the cusp of the fulfilment of God's purpose outlined in this chapter, and nearly, I'm going to say, everything required by those 13 verses that we've just read is either already in place, I believe, or is underway. And the purpose of this talk tonight is to show you that that's the case. Everything in those 13 verses is either in place or is underway. And we're going to see that as we proceed. So what then does Ezekiel 38 require? Well, the first two verses require a Eurasian dictator to dominate the continent. I think we might have him. Quite possibly might have him. It requires the territory east and north of Israel to be under Gogian control, verses 5 and 6. It requires a dependent Europe to fall under Gog's political control, verse 6, without the need for warfare. It requires the West Bank to be part of Israel proper, in verse 8. Amazing things happening there. It requires Israel to be at peace both internally and with near neighbours. That's happening as well, verses 8 to 11. It requires Israel to be very prosperous and envied by other nations. That's already in place. If you've seen Benjamin Netanyahu's recent speech in relation to that, you'll know how far that's advanced. It requires Yemen, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states to be the first to oppose the Gogian invasion of the land. Think about that. Yemen, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states beat Tarshish to object to the Gogian invasion. They're the first ones. What does that mean? It means they're the closest allies of Israel. That's ridiculous. They spent 70 years, those nations, trying to destroy Israel. but it's a requirement of Bible prophecy that they be Israel's closest allies at the time of Armageddon. I'll go into that as well. And we've got Britain and the young lions who follow suit in verse 13. Okay, so they're just some of the requirements of Ezekiel 38, 1 to 13. Let's pursue some of them. You know, the problem I had was, what do you put in and what do you leave out? And that was the difficulty. So, excuse me if I go fairly quickly, the machine gun style. It'll be on the screen, so what you can't pick up from words, read it on the screen. Okay, so here we go. You ready? Strap yourself in. Putin. Now we thought maybe Gorbachev might be the go. Putin fits the requirements not only of Ezekiel 38, but more particularly of Habakkuk 2. I wish I had a half an hour to talk about it. Even the way he came to power in 2000 is there in Habakkuk chapter 2. I think he's the man, brothers and sisters. Time will tell. He thinks he's the man because, you see, the requirement is that he stand down after 2 terms. Oh, not now. Because there is a proposal before the Duma to get rid of the 2-term requirement so that he can stand again for election in 2024. Not that elections mean anything in Russia. So I'm not going to read that. You can read it for yourself in the yellow. They're going to scrap that constitutional limit of 2 consecutive terms. But there's something more important happening in Russia in relation to Vladimir Putin. There's a push to make him a Tsar. Yeah, a Tsar. This article here, which goes back a little way, not that far back, makes this point. A group of pro-Kremlin activists, this is December last year, has a different idea. Proclaim him Tsar Vladimir. Now, he just happens to have a hero. His hero is Vladimir I, who ruled from a place called Kiev, which was the first capital of the Russian Empire, which is why Putin wants the Ukraine. More about that in a minute. He wants to be Vladimir, Tsar Vladimir II. We will do everything possible to make sure Putin stays in power as long as possible, said a politically active businessman. To thunderous applause from hundreds of Russian Orthodox and members of the country's top political parties, they were united by one cause: to return the monarchy to Russia. And they want to make Putin their Tsar. Well, it just so happens that in Upas Israel, page 432, Brother Thomas wrote, at some time hereafter, and that not far off, a Tsar of Russia will be both Emperor of Germany and autocrat of all the Russias. Brother Thomas might prove to be more accurate than we thought, because Russia is going to have a Tsar. Now, we read in Ezekiel 38 verse 2 that Gog, which we know as a title, means the one at the top. It's the title of a dictator. It's an individual who has what they call the vertical of power, which Vladimir Putin has and boasts about. That is one man like a Tsar who sits at the top, and his word is law, and if you don't obey it, you go to jail or you go in a box. All right? That's the vertical of power. He's got it. Nobody argues with him in Russia. That's what Gog means. The one at the top. It said of him that he is of, and that's how that should read, as you can see there on the base, he's of the land of Magog. So where's Magog? Well, what you can see there around that red line is the border that the historians say was Magog. It includes, on the eastern portion, the largest country inside that circle, which happens to be the Ukraine. Why is that important, brothers and sisters? Well, because that is where the Russian Empire was established. That's where the Rus first established their kingdom. Their first capital, 989 AD, was Kiev. Well, Kiev today is the capital of an independent nation called the Ukraine. It's not going to be independent for very long. And that's why there are rebels on the east of Ukraine. That's why in Moldavia, Russia has a couple of thousand soldiers. That's why Putin took control of the Crimea in 2014. And that's why he's doing a lot of things. I'm not going to mention all of them. This will do. March 29th, 2019. Ukraine's Orthodox Church faces eviction in Russia-annexed Crimea. Now, why is this happening? Well, it's happening because of what happened between August and November last year. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, or at least a good proportion of it, more than half of it, decided that they no longer wanted to be ruled by the Patriarchate of Moscow. And so they switched allegiance to the Patriarch of Constantinople, which is what they still call Istanbul in the religious world. That's what Putin calls it, by the way. Constantinople. So they switched their allegiance to the head of the Greek Orthodox Church in Constantinople. That went down like a lead balloon in the Kremlin. That really got up Putin's nose. He is strongly supported by the church in Russia, and he's not going to allow that to happen, brothers and sisters. So he's been chipping away at the Ukraine. Immediately after they did that in November, he put forth a decree to cut off certain delivery of goods to Ukraine and to make life very difficult for them. And this is the next thing that's happened. Ukraine's independent Orthodox Church is facing eviction in Signposts, the capital of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula, which was seized by Russia in 2014. So he's going to kick them out. He's going to make them pay for them taking their allegiance to Constantinople. So that's something that is boiling under the surface. And one day he's going to take over the whole of Ukraine. He's going to have, brothers and sisters, portion of the land of Magog. But he won't be content with just that, will he? Because you see, he's got plans, and this was revealed by this defector. This is an article from the 5th of March 2019. A female tank commander defects for love, wrote this article. And it talks about this love story. But when she defected from the rebels because she had a relationship with a Ukrainian, she spilled the beans. She told them, because she was actually a commander, she told them that there were plans for the invasion of the Ukraine. Now it's going to happen. And that's because the Bible says it has to happen. Gog of the land of Magog. But of course, Magog also includes other nations like Germany, doesn't it? And this is the article that I was given this morning by Brother Ian, who brought it up from his son Andrew. So I thought I'd put it in because we've got to have sensational things happening in 2019. Okay? So this article, this is the heading. What you see on the top there is the actual heading of the article, as you can see. Here, Brussels beware Vladimir Putin plotting to take over the EU. And this is part of what it said. No one is looking forward to the forthcoming European elections more than Russian President Vladimir Putin. One of the Russian leader's defining characteristics is his unerring ability to identify an opportunity in the face of even the most extreme adversity. Mr. Putin views the EU elections as an opportune moment to restore Russia's standing in Europe. The Kremlin's desire to steer the course of European politics in a direction more favourable to Russia is not a new phenomenon. Concerns about Russian meddling have been raised in France, Italy, Austria, Greece, the Netherlands and Germany, while questions remain as to whether Moscow tried to interfere in Britain's 2016 referendum on leaving the European Union. I could say a lot more about that, but there's no time. I want to move now to what he's doing with Turkey. He was very quick, said this article back last year in June, to toast Erdogan's success in the Turkish election. Why would he want to do that, brothers and sisters, do you think? Do you remember the 24th of November 2015 when the Turks shot down a Russian jet over the border between Syria and Turkey? Remember that? The first thing he did was to close the borders, to shut down trade, and 2 weeks later he sent a letter to Erdogan demanding the return of the Hagia Sophia. Why would you ask for that? Well, the Hagia Sophia is like the Vatican to Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox people. That's where the Russian Orthodox came from. They were kicked out by the Turks in 1453. That's their Vatican. Of course, it became a museum. I'm going to show you what's happening to it, or what might happen to it very shortly. He was very quick. So why do you think Putin then changed his tune in relation to Turkey and started cuddling up to Erdogan? Started to supply the S-400 missiles. Why did he do that, brothers and sisters? Well, he did it because of prophecy. In Daniel 8 verse 25 we read this. And through his policy also he shall cause craft. Brother Thomas says that means or indicates priestcraft. It's got to do with religion. He shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. That passage in Daniel 8 is about the ruler at the time of Armageddon, the ruler of Constantinople, the eastern leg of the image of Nebuchadnezzar, the base from which Gog will make his advance into the land of Israel and beyond. Brothers and sisters, Putin is angling to achieve things. Now, why would he do this? Well, Turkey just happens to be a member of NATO. But Turkey wants to be a member of the European Union. The European Union doesn't want them because they're Muslim. But you see, the problem is that they think their defence depends on NATO, and Turkey is part of NATO. So Putin is in there because he wants to totally undermine NATO and the European Union. That's what he's on about. And he's using this method of peace. By peace he shall destroy many. So what's Mr. Erdogan done recently? Well, foolishly, a week ago, March the 31st, he declared that Istanbul's Hagia Sophia should be renamed a mosque instead of a museum. Really? He's got rocks in his head, hasn't he? This is like sticking a needle in Vladimir Putin's nose. He is going, brothers and sisters, to pay for that. So it's amazing how these things pan out. The US, of course, has suspended the delivery of the F-35. This is this wonderful jet plane, this fighter plane that they've developed. And because Turkey has been an ally of the US in the past, and because they're part of NATO, the US were going to supply F-35, so they've just pulled the pin. They pulled the pin because, of course, Turkey is also going to get S-400 missiles from Russia. Really? I mean, the S-400 is designed to take down the F-35. How ridiculous is that? And so you can see what's happening there. The hand of God. Isn't it, mate? Wouldn't it be wonderful to be an angel, brothers and sisters, and to pull the strings of events in the world? This is exactly what they're doing. They're pulling the strings, they're shifting, they're guiding, they're manipulating every day. And we read about these things because God wants us to know how close we are to the return of his Son. That's what that's about. We couldn't ask for more than what we've been given. Let's move on. Russian control from Syria to Pakistan before Armageddon. Now, normally I would spend about 10 minutes on this, and some of you in this audience have heard me speak about this several times, so I'm not going to do it again for the sake of time. I'm just going to give you a summary. There are 3 passages in Scripture that require God to be in control of Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and portion of Pakistan at the time of Armageddon. That's why, of course, we believe Russia is in Syria right now. It's not going anywhere, as you'll see in a moment. Those 3 passages are Ezekiel 38 verse 5, which says, the very first name there is Persia. Talk a bit more about that in a minute. The second passage is Daniel 7 verse 7, which talks about the residue, that is the territory that the Roman Empire never gobbled up of the 3 previous empires. It's the residue which has to be stamped with the feet of this 4th beast. So we have to have a revival of the 4th beast, indeed of all the 4 beasts, in the latter days. They stamp that residue with their feet. And the other reference is Daniel chapter 11 and verse 40, where we read, of course, that the king of the north shall come against him, the him being the power occupying Constantinople, which happens to be the Turks. And to be called the king of the north, you have to be what they were. You can't take their biblical title without being what they were. So what were the king of the north and the king of the south? Well, they were foreign occupying powers of those territories. In the case of the king of the north, it was the territory from Syria to Pakistan, the Seleucid kingdom. In the case of the king of the south, it was Egypt. And of course, Daniel 11 verse 40 has had its partial fulfilment in the events of 1917, when Britain, a foreign occupying power of Egypt, pushed against the Turks, the hymn of the verse, and pushed them out of Palestine. as a means to establish the state of Israel. The second part of Daniel 11:40 hasn't been fulfilled. And the king of the north, that means a foreign occupying power of a territory from Syria to Pakistan, shall come against him, the power occupying Constantinople, Turks. All right? That's still to be fulfilled. So brothers and sisters, we're watching some very, very interesting things happen. Tartus to remain Russian. 2010, we got within a few miles of this place, Tartus. It's a port on the Syrian coast. It was inhabited at the time by 50,000 Russians because they were building it with Russian money as a port to harbour their warships in the Mediterranean. Right? Well, they've now got a 49-year lease on Tartus. It's going to remain Russian. It's true also of Latakia, a bit further north. They've got a 49-year lease on that, with, of course, extensions thereafter. So what we have here, of course, is a reference to Russia dabbling in this region because they're going to stay there. They're not going anywhere. In fact, they are going to go somewhere. They're going to go further east. Now you see this name Persia in verse 5 of Ezekiel 38? When you read that name, brothers and sisters, what do you think of? Well, Iran. Well, yes and no. Yes, it includes Iran. But when you look at what Ezekiel understood by Persia when he wrote that, it's a bit different. Now this is a map. This is a map of the Medo or Median Empire, which became the Medo-Persian Empire in due time, between 625 and 550 BC. Now you will know that the Babylonian Empire, which is this area here in red, was established by Nebuchadnezzar in 606 BC. And it only lasted for 70 years. It was gone by 539. Okay? So it only lasted about 70 years. It was there for a very real purpose, of course. It was the last gasp, as it were, of Nimrod's kingdom. But it was immediately replaced. Now, the Medo-Persian Empire lasted for over 200 years. And the Greek Empire that followed it was another 200 and something years. So Babylon was relatively short in the scheme of things. And they had the problem right throughout their period of the Medes breathing down their neck. And ultimately in 539, Cyrus overthrew Babylon. So you see, when Ezekiel writes, he's not just thinking about Iran. He's thinking about from Syria to Pakistan. All right? That's the period, that's the territory he's talking about, that he understood to be Persia. So as we said, when Gog takes what's called the residue in Daniel chapter 7 verse 7, takes this territory from Syria, this is that green area, that's the Seleucid kingdom, they had their capital in Syria, they went right across to the Indus River. When Gog takes control of this region, puts its own governments in place, then, brothers and sisters, they can make their attack on the hymn of Daniel 11 verse 40. And then when they've got that secure, the eastern leg of the image is there, then they can make their advance into the Middle East and go down in through Israel into Egypt. So, let's move on to another part of Ezekiel 38. Netanyahu and Putin meet urgently over Iran's new command hub in Aleppo. This is from April the 2nd, 2019. Now, Israel's already attacked the new Iranian base in Aleppo. It was only there for a few days and they bombed it. They do not want the Iranians on their border, especially not close to the Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is still a huge problem. And so what we're seeing, brothers and sisters, is some wonderful developments in relation to those three passages that we've been talking about. Let's head a bit further south. You see there in verse 5 of Ezekiel 38, it says Persia, Ethiopia and Libya with them. So what's the Ethiopia here? Well, look the word up, of course, it's Cush. Cush. There were three Cushes in the Word of God. There was Cush number 1. the original Cush of Genesis chapter 2, verses 13 and 14, which is where the Garden of Eden was in that region. There was Cush number 2, very minor in a sense, because this is in Numbers chapter 12, verse 1, where we read that Moses had married Zipporah, and she was a Cushite, an Ethiopian. And that was the problem between Moses, Aaron and Miriam. Remember that? Well, there's a little Cush there. There's a third Cush in Acts chapter 8, verse 27. It's a reference to the Ethiopian eunuch. The Cush referred to here it may include part of the old Ethiopia, but it really is the land of the Sudan. And Sudan is south, the nation immediately south of Egypt. Libya, of course, is the nation immediately west of Egypt. So Egypt is surrounded by the Confederates of Gog. And that's why, of course, Gog, when they come down the plains of Israel and with many ships, they're not initially aiming for Israel. They're aiming for Egypt. Right? That's what Daniel 11 says. They're aiming for Egypt. That's because Egypt at that time will not be part of their confederacy, but the nations around them will be. And we'll go into that a bit more in a minute. So what about Russian involvement in Sudan? Well, going back to 2017, the leader, he's just been deposed by a coup. His name is Bashir. He went to Moscow and he asked Putin for protection from the US, and Putin was quick to respond. Here's why, this is the headlines of the articles, here's why Russia might set up a Red Sea base in Sudan. Well, he's been deposed in the last couple of months, and we read this from the Moscow Times on the 11th of April 2019. Russian lawmakers have spoken out against what they called an unconstitutional military coup in Sudan that has reportedly ousted long-time leader and close Russian ally Omar al-Bashir. It goes on to say that one of their spokesmen said in the green on the screen, "No matter how the new government is configured, there is no doubt that they will seek cooperation with Russia in the near future. We've always maintained close relations with Sudan, even in Soviet times. This country has the most important geographical position," notice these words, "the most important geographical position on the African continent and in the Arab world." Big things are happening there. Russia is going to make sure they consolidate their power and their control. They're going to build a naval base there. In fact, they're going to build a military base in the Sudan. That was the original intention. And that's exactly what will happen in due time because of that prophecy. Let's go to Libya, to the west of Egypt, because they're mentioned next in Ezekiel 38 verse 5. We've got Persia, which we've seen as that territory from Syria to Pakistan. We've got the Sudan, and we've got Libya, all of whom will be close confidants of Gog. Well, what about recent developments in Libya? We know that the Arab Spring ultimately brought the overthrow of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. He met a very sticky end. And a former ally of Gaddafi, who had in fact to escape from Libya for 20 odd years and lived in the US, Field Marshal, he called himself a Field Marshal, Khalifa Haftar, heads the Libyan National Army, the LNA. And they control eastern Libya, and they're supported by Russia. Haftar has visited Moscow at least twice that I've heard of to seek help from Putin, and Russia actually landed troops on the Egyptian coast in support of Haftar in early 2018. Haftar's forces have in the last couple of weeks entered Tripoli. It's not the capital of Libya at the moment, but it's the place where the government sits, to overthrow the internationally recognised government of Libya. I'm going pretty quickly, aren't I? We're ticking them off though, aren't we? Yeah. So let's read the next verse of Ezekiel 38. Gomer. Well, we know that Gomer is a reference to France and the nations of Western Europe. Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters, and all his bands, and many people with thee. Now, this article from September last year made the point that even with a new president in the country of Armenia, Russia, and particularly Vladimir Putin, has very close ties with the leaders of that country. And the new president has come on board like the previous president, seeking the assistance of Russia. The Pope went to Armenia in 2016 and said that the Turks committed genocide. Now I want to just point out a couple of things about Armenia. It's probably gone under the radar with some of us, but it's very important what's happening there. So who is this Tagama of Ezekiel 38 and verse 6? Well, go to the commentaries like Keel and Dalish, they will tell you Tagama is the name of the Armenians, who are still called the House of Thorgum or the Torkomansi. And in actual fact, what happened was that between 1915 and 1922, so the Turks took advantage of the events of the First World War, which began in 1914. They took advantage of that. They committed genocide against the Armenians. They killed at least 1.5 million. Many of them were actually driven into the wilderness to perish from starvation and thirst. And they seized 80% of the territory of Armenia. Now, if you have a look at this map, here's the historic Armenia. This is the red line. That was the original Armenia in 1915. They also had what they called a Little Armenia over here in Cilicia. Right? Well, the Turks seized all of that. They seized the bulk of this, and this today, the red, is the current Armenia. That's why you see they're called a house. Their country's gone. They're the house of Tagama. And the Pope went there to tell them that he supported them, that the Turks in fact had committed genocide. And Putin has had a very close relationship with the leaders of Armenia since 2004. He's been supplying weapons to them, etc. See what's going on there, brothers and sisters? It won't be long. It won't be long when Gog takes that entire territory from Syria right across to Pakistan, that he'll give back at least portion of the territory of the Armenians, the house of Tagama. I said there's not one thing. There's not one thing in Ezekiel 38, 1 to 13 that's not either already in place or happening before our eyes. You be the judge of how close we are. So let's jump to Europe, shall we? Briefly. NATO. It's nearly dead. Now you would have heard that Donald Trump, when he came to office, said that the Americans pay too much for the protection of Europe. Remember that? He wants them to pay more. Well, Germany has just gone to their new budget. And this article, this is July 2018, okay? This article tells us that the reason for Trump's difficulty was that Germany is building, with Russia, a pipeline through the Baltic, under the Baltic, to bring gas. And the President questioned the necessity of the alliance that formed a bulwark against Soviet aggression. I mean, the man has at least got some common sense. He might not have much else, but he's got common sense. He's a businessman. It doesn't make any sense for America to be pouring money into NATO to protect the Europeans from the Russians when their Europeans are going into an alliance with the Russians on critical things like gas. It just doesn't make any sense. And so he's questioned that. Well, Germany's just brought out their new budget. Germany's NATO backslide. And they have not budgeted to bring NATO spending up to the level demanded by the US President. And they're playing into his hands. Because the day will come when Trump will say, that's enough. We are not going to put any more money into protecting you from Russia when you're in partnership with Russia and you're not even providing funds to increase your spending. Brothers and sisters, we could say a lot more about the European nations, of course, and they make their appearance here in the name Gomer, verse 6 of Ezekiel 38. But we're not going to do that. I'm going to turn to Britain. You a bit concerned about Brexit, where that's heading? There's a few people in Britain that are concerned. They voted to come out of the European Union. Where's this thing going? Are you wondering why the things that are happening in relation to Brexit are happening? I want to explain to you why I think they're happening. Now, this is a cartoonist depiction. You've got, of course, Britain stepping off. This is the plank. Here is the idiot with the 12 stars preaching to the unconverted, because many of these nations They say Italy, the Netherlands, Austria, Greece, France, and even Germany now have strong anti-EU movements. And you notice the rise of the right-wing parties in Europe recently? Most of them are anti-European Union. Italy is ruled by a right-wing party at the moment. Many of them have voiced their desire to get out of the European Union. And I'll explain to you why that has to happen anyway in a minute. So this is a pretty fitting cartoon. Now, we know, of course, that Britain was supposed to sign the departure documents and get out by the 29th of March 2019. It didn't happen. And it's still not happening. Now, I haven't heard the very latest news, but I think it's still up in the air. Now, this is an article came out the 22nd of March from the ABC. Brexit delay approved by the European Union. This is when May went and got some kind of agreement to extend. Conditional on Westminster's support for Theresa May's deal, which of course is very tenuous, isn't it? They can't get that thing agreed to in the Parliament. All 27 European Union leaders have signed off on the final communique. But a gentleman got up and spoke for them. This is the fella, Jean-Claude Juncker. He said the European Union had done much to accommodate Britain and could go no further. If that doesn't happen, he said, and if Great Britain does not leave at the end of March, then we are, I am sorry to say, in the hands of God. Now, he's no prophet, but he's quite right. They're in the hands of God. So, what is really happening here, brothers and sisters? Well, history is important in this matter. Here we have the legs and the feet of the image. As Brother Thomas points out, the feet have yet to be formed. They are being formed in the events that we're witnessing. We've got, of course, the western leg, Rome. We've got the eastern leg, Constantinople. In 420 AD, the Roman Empire was finally resolved into two legs. Now, you know in its history it went through many iterations. There were times when Rome had 3 parts, and then had 4 parts, then it had 2 parts, and then 1 part under Constantine. And then it went back to more divisions, and it went on like that for a long time. When finally the empire became 2 parts, it was when the 2 emperors, one in Constantinople and one in Rome, both brothers, agreed to split the empire up between themselves. The western part went down the gurgler shortly thereafter, and of course the eastern part went on for 1,000 years to the overthrow by the Turks. So, brothers and sisters, what we have here is a historical event. That was 420 AD when that happened. We got the 2 legs. Well, the Roman Empire withdrew from Britain in 410 AD, 10 years before the 2 legs were formed. The feet with the 10 toes is a confederation of southern European states. Notice the phrase southern European states, because it's a reformation of what existed historically. The Roman Empire of old. United for a time by Gog, but it's a brittle fusion of democracy and false religion held together by the humanistic spirit of our times. So here's how it happened. The end of Roman rule. Now, you may not be able to read the detail of the departure dates, but let me read them out to you. In 383, there was the final departure of the Romans from the west and the north. In 401 AD, there was the final departure from Hadrian's Wall, which is halfway up, of course, Britain. In 407, there was the final departure from the southeast, which of course means London. And in 409, there was the expulsion of Roman magistrates from the cities. And in 410, the rescript of Honorius, one of the 2 emperors who were going to divide the empire amongst themselves, Honorius wrote his rescript, which brought all the Romans out of Britain. You know what that's telling us? It was not the British who rejected Europe. At the end, brothers and sisters, it was the Europeans who rejected the British. And that's why I think it's so significant when he says, if the Brits can't get their act together, we're in the hand of God. And I think history will be repeated. I believe what will happen is the Europeans will say, enough is enough. If you mob can't get your act together in Britain to go down the path that your people chose in June 2016, then we'll do the job for you. And they will cut Britain off. And that's exactly what God wants, isn't it? He wants Britain to be completely out of Europe. He doesn't want their connection with Europe. This is what Theresa May wants. She wants to continue some vital connections, they think, for trade and etc. God doesn't want that. He wants Britain to be out of Europe. Hard Brexit, here we come. If history is to be repeated, it will be Europe that finally withdraws from Britain. So what is happening in Europe with the European Union? Very important things, brothers and sisters, because it's falling apart. And the Great Depression that's coming, and it's coming pretty soon, they say either this year or next, it will come. That's why there's signs. The housing market in Australia is dropping. There are signs happening that things will fall apart. We're well past the cycle. It's only being held by the angels. Because you see, as I'll point out in one of our studies further down during the week, we will be taken on the eve of that Great Depression to the judgment seat of Christ to join the resurrected dead. That is what Luke 17 requires. Christ's warning that we will be taken, brothers and sisters, on the eve of the great collapse of the prosperity of human society, which happened in the days of Noah and the days of Lot. More about that later. So what does prophecy require in Europe in the last days? Well, here's just one, Revelation 17. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings which have received no kingdom as yet, which have power. They receive power as kings 1 hour, which we know is 30 years, 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. So we're being told something. When you, of course, line that up with Daniel chapter 2 and you've got the 10 toes of Nebuchadnezzar's image, and you go to chapter 7 of Daniel and you've got the 10 horns, there will be 10 independent nations with one political agenda shaped and guided by the papacy, which at that time, because of the Great Depression, brothers and sisters, will have great power in Europe. The European Union, or Eurozone as they call it, as we see it today, is doomed. British withdrawal and the bankruptcy among southern states in particular will see the northern nations leave for self-preservation. So those richer northern nations are no longer going to carry the bankrupt nations of the south. So what are we going to get? We're going to get the revival of the old Roman Empire as it was until its dying days when the barbarians broke it up and formed the 10 horns. So where was it? Well, there it is. Its boundaries in the north was the Rhine and the Danube. That's as far as they got. Oh, they pushed into Germania for a while and got kicked out. Their boundary was the Rhine and the Danube. And that's where those 10 horns were formed by barbarian invasion. Right? So that's what we're going to get back again. So the European Union as we know it will fall apart. The Great Depression will finish that job. We'll be long since gone by that time. And religion will be revived because that's what people do when you go into times of great poverty, times of trouble such as never was, we read in Daniel 12. What do people do? Well, God's shown us what they do. Because in Russia in the 1990s, you'll recall, when the communist regime fell apart and there was enormous poverty in Russia, what did the people do? Well, they revived the Russian Orthodox Church. The communists had spent 70 years. They actually bulldozed 10,000 Russian Orthodox churches. And they've been building churches, some of them unbelievably grand, in Russia ever since. People go back to religion when they're in poverty and trouble. That's what will happen in Europe. And we'll get our fourth empire back again, brothers and sisters. It will be the revival of the beast of the sea. Revelation 13 verses 1 to 10. Go back to that phase of history again. History will repeat itself. with the papacy having enormous political clout in Europe. It'll be the fourth beast of Daniel 7 verse 7, which Christ and the saints have to destroy, so it's got to be there. You can't destroy something that's not there. It's got to be revived again. And we get Babylon the Great of Revelation chapter 17. Whew. I mean, I could have spent half an hour just on that matter. I'm not going to do any more. Because I want to move to what I think is the most important thing that's been happening. The events in the Middle East. I mentioned Israel's prosperity. Israel had socialist prime ministers from 1948. They couldn't run a backyard, leave alone a country. And so Israel's economy was a basket case. They had support from America. If they hadn't had support from America, huge handouts, they wouldn't have survived. God made sure of that. But that wasn't what prophecy required. What prophecy required was Ezekiel 38 verse 12. When God comes down upon the land, it's to take a spoil and to take a prey, to turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited. The people that are gathered out of the nations which have gotten cattle and goods that dwell in the navel of the land. More about that in a minute too. So what was required was a change. Ezekiel 38:12. So God put Benjamin Netanyahu in power from 96 to 99, and again as finance minister from 2003 and 4. Then from 2009 to 2019, he's just been re-elected. Remember, just been re-elected. He made radical changes, particularly as finance minister, to the way Israel did business. They adopted the Canadian and Australian models of finance. You remember that in 2007, 2008, Australia and Canada actually survived the global financial crisis better than anybody else. That's because we've got tight financial rules. That's what Israel adopted under Netanyahu. And of course, he lowered tax. He encouraged entrepreneurs, even those who went bankrupt. He said, I'll give you a second chance. That's why Israel today leads the world in technology. That's why they've become the envy of nations. That's why they're so important in relation to cyber security. And you can go on and on and on. I'd love to show you a little video clip, which we don't have time to do now. A video clip of Netanyahu's speech. It's just astonishing what that nation has accomplished in the last 10 or so years. It had to be that way, brothers and sisters. God was not going to come down upon a land of poverty and misery. We're going to come down upon a land that was envied by other nations, and that's true today, regardless of what happens between now and Armageddon, still 10 years away. Think about that. Even after the Depression, it will be Israel that comes out best of all nations. They will be envied because of their prosperity. That didn't even look possible at the time when I was baptised in 1967, did it? But it's a reality now. Israel, of course, has been involved in many wars, some of them designed to destroy them. The 48-49 War of Independence, designed to snuff them out as a new state. In 56, the Sinai Campaign, when Britain and France used Israel as their means to take control of the Suez Canal, we had the Sinai Campaign. Let's just go back to that briefly. The Six-Day War, of course, we are familiar with. In 1967, one of the greatest events of modern history. And the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which they almost lost had it not been for the influence of the American weapons that were given to them and overshadowed by the Almighty. All of those wars, really, in many ways were designed, apart from the Sinai Campaign, all of them were designed to destroy Israel. And the nations involved were their immediate neighbours. Egypt, principally, under Gamal Nasser. Then, of course, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Iraq, Iran, and so on. All of them determined to destroy Israel. But they weren't successful. And last year, on the 14th of May, Israel celebrated its 70th anniversary, and the US moved its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Australia even got in on the act, and we had our Prime Minister saying that West Jerusalem, they didn't mention East Jerusalem, that's still up in the air as far as they were concerned, but West Jerusalem was the capital of Israel. And Mike Pence got involved in January last year. He went into the Middle East and he made it very clear to the leaders of Egypt and Jordan and other nations that they had to stop fighting Donald Trump's Palestinian policy. And they have. I want to show you what's happened. And then we had this headline, 22nd of March 2019. Pompeo says God may have sent Trump to save Israel from Iran. Really? He was asked if President Trump right now has been sort of raised for such a time as this, just like Queen Esther, to help save the Jewish people from an Iranian menace. As a Christian, said Pompeo, I certainly believe that's possible. I am confident that the Lord is at work here. Yeah, he is. He is at work here, brothers and sisters. Nobody would have thought that Donald Trump would become President of the United States except God. And he made sure of it, because he wanted that man to fulfil things that wouldn't have happened had we had Clinton or some other leader of the US. And that's why these amazing things have happened. Trump not only shifted the embassy to Jerusalem, he now, of course, 22nd of March, with this article, he's declared the Golan Heights to be essentially Israel territory, which they took, of course, in the 67 and 73 wars. Of course, other nations don't agree with that. Among them, Russia, Iran, even the Arab states reject the unlawful US decision on the Golan Heights. This article, the 26th of March this year. So what is Russia going to do about that? Well, Putin being Putin, he's in there. So he's just signed a $2 billion contract for fighter jets with Egypt. He knows where Egypt's heading in this situation. He knows that Egypt's cuddling up, not just to the Arab states to the east, but to Israel. So what's he going to do? He's just put his hat in the ring. $2 billion worth of fighter jets for Egypt. Harking back to the days of Nasser, remember? Russian support both for Nasser and Sadat. So why is all this happening, brothers and sisters? Why have there been such dramatic changes? Well, the election of Trump is one of the factors involved. But this is the other one. This is the issue that has brought about huge change between 2017, which, in my opinion, for what that's worth, in my opinion, was the most significant year of fulfilled Bible prophecy, or fulfilling Bible prophecy, since 1967. And if you do the maths, between 1967 and 2017, it was a jubilee period. That's why I believe that year was so highly significant in the scheme of things. This is the Arab world. It's been divided for nearly 4 centuries over an issue of who should be their leader. So the Arab world's divided up into Sunnis, who are about 80% plus, and Shias. Now the blue of this map, you see the very dark blue? That's the Sunni nations. Muslim, Sunni nations. Even Indonesia to the north of us is all Sunni. Okay? The green is the Shias. Now Iran is 100% Shia. You're a Sunni in Iran, you're a pretty lonely fellow. Next door, Iraq is 60% Sunni. It used to be ruled, of course, that's 60% Shia, I should say, 40% Sunni. It used to be ruled by Sunnis. So what's happened? Well, what's happened is that they have gone to war. And Saudi Arabia is the head of the Sunni nations, and Iran is the head of the Shia nations. And both of them know that there's going to be a war between those powers. And that's what's changed everything. And that's why things like this are happening. This is an article going back to 2017 about changing the Arab mind. And this happened in Saudi Arabia, and it's been ongoing in Saudi Arabia ever since. The Arab mind must liberate itself from the legacy of former Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, and the legacy of both the Sunni and Shia sects, which has instilled for political interests the culture of Jew hatred and denial of the historic right in the region. It all began in 2017. Something else happened very important in 2017. Debka called it a game-changing event. Naming bin Salman Saudi heir impacts US-Israel, wrote this article. The Saudi king's decision to elevate his son Prince Mohammed bin Salman, 31 at the time, to crown prince and heir to the throne in place of his cousin Mohammed bin Nayef as part of a broad reshuffle is not merely the internal affair of the royal hierarchy, but a game-changing international event. They were quite right. And of course, Donald Trump had some influence behind that as well. You're aware, brothers and sisters, that Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who's a Jew, is a very close friend of Mohammed bin Salman. Yeah, MBS they call him, the man who organised the murder of Khashoggi in Istanbul. Remember him? Yeah. Well, he got away with that because, of course, Trump and Kushner are in hock with this guy. He was the defence minister before he became Crown Prince. Now, Crown Prince is the job that rules Saudi Arabia. The king is a figurehead, right, and the Crown Prince is the ruler. So, when he was defence minister, he knew that war was coming with Iran, with the Shias. Now, this is an article, 29th of November 2017. The third leg of the three-legged peace stall is a joint Saudi and Israeli effort to defeat Iran and Hezbollah and develop a plan to interrupt an imperial desire for a Shia crescent. When an Iranian missile was fired into the Saudi capital, the Crown Prince realised a direct confrontation with Iran is inevitable. He also assessed his ability to defeat Iran in a land battle and concluded his forces do not measure up. However, with Israeli assistance, a joint force might prevail. Hence, the Crown Prince is developing joint military manoeuvres with Israel as his key ally. Really? This is one of the nations who spent squillions on to destroy Israel. And now it's turned completely around, brothers and sisters. Now they're seeking Israel as a close ally. Trump administration, of course, is also pouring cold water on the Palestinian cause, as this article, October last year, pointed out, citing the refusal of Palestinian leaders to enter into peace talks with Israel. Now, I know I've been speaking for 57 minutes. I'm not unaware of the time, brothers and sisters, and I know that many of you are tired. Can you give me another 5 minutes or so? 10 minutes, you reckon? Because I've got some important things to tell you. Okay? Come with me to Ezekiel 38:13. Sheba and Dedan. Who are they? Well, we know who Tarshish is. We've got a problem with that. Who's Sheba and Dedan? Well, modern Yemen is Sheba. That is why Sheba of old, Yemen of today, is in so much heartache and grief right now. People dying in their millions. Okay? That's the worst place in the world right now, is Yemen. Why? Because the angels are at work. Saudi Arabia is in there with the Gulf states, and they will ultimately get rid of the Houthi. They will restore the rightful government of Yemen, and Yemen will be locked in to the Saudi Arabian orbit. Yemen is the Sheba. Have a look at the maps. Kingdom of Sheba. Okay? Dedan's a bit further to the east. Dedan is up here, brothers and sisters. It includes these Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. That's Dedan of history. Sheba and Dedan. Okay? Oman is a principal part of the biblical Dedan. So what's happening with Oman? 28th of October last year. Oman publicly called on Middle East countries to accept Israel. Yeah. And, moreover, at a recent summit this year in Poland, Netanyahu sat beside foreign ministers of Yemen and Oman. Israel's also working very closely with Qatar and Bahrain, other Gulf states. So why is Israel cozying up to Gulf monarchies, was the headline of this article recently, March the 19th, 2019. In mid-February 2019, Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, flew to Warsaw for a highly unusual conference. He met the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates and two other Gulf states, we just mentioned them, Yemen and Oman, with whom they have no diplomatic relations at this stage. The meeting publicly showcased the remarkable fact that Israel, as Netanyahu was so keen to advertise, as winning acceptance of a sort, from the wealthiest countries in the Arab world. And there's support from the other side, because in the last 18 months in Saudi Arabia they've been showing documentaries on Israel on Saudi Arabian television. The documentary reconstructs the story of the birth of Israel in a way that is free of ideology and partisanship. So they're trying to change the Arab mind, because they need Israel in their warfare against Iran. Isn't that incredible, the way God can work, brothers and sisters? Of course, the Palestinians blame Trump for all of this. They say the liquidation of the Palestinian cause is the work of Trump through the deal of the century promoted by the American president and his son-in-law Kushner. So what is this deal of the century they're talking about? Now, this is where I'm going to wake you up, because I want you to join me in two passages of Scripture. Joel chapter 3. We're getting near the end. Joel chapter 3. We know what Joel 3 is about. The first couple of verses tell us that. It lines up with Zechariah 14 and Ezekiel 38. It's the Gogian invasion of the land. All nations come against Jerusalem, etc. So if you're there, brothers and sisters, let me just read you a portion of this article. This goes back to December 2017. Riyadh has dropped its demand that Israel accept a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. Since the original Saudi peace proposal, which the Prince, that is MBS, called Plan A, was dead, it is necessary to move forward to Plan B. Plan B is essentially as follows. The state of Palestine would be established in the Gaza Strip, plus large tracts of territory to be annexed from northern Sinai. Egypt has agreed to that outline. Really? Yeah, really. I want to show you that even the Palestinians know that now. You see, the West Bank has to be part of Israel proper at the time of Armageddon, not a Palestinian state. That's why we read of the mountains of Israel in Ezekiel 38 verse 8. Not the mountains of Palestine, the mountains of Israel. So where are the mountains of Israel? Well, they run from Hebron to Mount Gilboa. 90% of them are in the West Bank. And the Likud Party, this was the last political decision made in 2017 anywhere on the planet. It was made at 11:45 p.m. on the 31st of December 2017 by the Likud Party. They made a decision to legally annex portions of the West Bank as a proposal to ultimately take it all over. That was made 18 months ago, brothers and sisters. And now the Palestinians know it. This article, 31st of March 2019, you've got Abbas. The heading of the article is US to allow Israel to annex parts of the West Bank and to give Hamas Gaza. Isn't that amazing? Now, I'm not going to read all that because of the sake of time. But it's actually going to happen very soon. The West Bank will become part of Israel proper, just as the Bible says. And there are two places in Ezekiel 38 that tell us that. There's verse 8, the mountains of Israel. Right? God comes down upon the mountains of Israel. And verse 12 says that these people dwell in the midst of the land. And the Hebrew word means the navel of the land. If you see the land of Israel as a body, where's the navel? In the West Bank. Right? So it will become part of Israel proper. And of course they're now talking about how painful that's going to be, especially for the Palestinians, but also for Israel in part. But this is the latest article. This is the 23rd of April 2019 in the American form there. And this was Kushner about the deal of the century, which is about to be announced. And he said, we will do something different. So you in Joel chapter 3? I'm going to go back to those two references, if I can find them. Now, Joel chapter 3 verse 4. We read this. And yea, what have ye to do with me, O Tyre and Sidon, and all the coasts of Palestine? Will ye render to me a recompense, etc.? Let me just ask you one simple question, brothers and sisters. Does the West Bank have a coastline? No. The closest it gets to the Mediterranean is 9 miles. It doesn't have a coastline. And we read here about Tyre and Sidon, which was the Hezbollah is there, and that's why that reference is made, and all the coasts of Palestine. Come to Zephaniah chapter 2, a bit further on. Zephaniah chapter 2. Now, we've always got to get our context right. We know what the context of Joel 3 was about. That's not difficult at all. What's the context of Zephaniah 2 about? Look at verse 11. Yahweh will be terrible unto them, for he will famish all the gods of the earth. And men shall worship him, every one from his place, even all the isles of the nations. So, when will that happen, do you think? Oh, it's the kingdom, isn't it? Clearly the kingdom. That's your context. So the events before are the lead up to the kingdom. Read from verse 4 of Zephaniah chapter 2. For Gaza shall be forsaken and Ashkelon a desolation. They shall drive out Ashdod at the noonday, and Ekron shall be rooted up. Woe to the inhabitants of the sea coast, the nation of the Kerethites. Who are Kerethites? Philistines, aren't they? The word of Yahweh is against you, O Canaan, of, and that should read, of the land of the Philistines. Now, again, I ask you a question. West Bank have a coastline? No. Does the Gaza Strip have a coastline? Yes. Isn't that amazing? The deal. Who would have thought that it could happen this way? But it's happening, brothers and sisters. The West Bank will become part of Israel proper, and the Palestinian state will be along the Gaza Strip and into what today is Egypt, in the Sinai Peninsula. It's got a coastline. So, amazing things are going on in relation to that. So here's my final slide, bar one. I know I've been speaking for I get my reputation, it's been destroyed again. Anyway, I hope it's been useful to you. Israel's intention to annex the West Bank will fulfil Ezekiel 38, verse 8. Israel, once a basket case economically, is now highly prosperous and envied in fulfilment of Ezekiel 38, verse 12. The growing dependency of many nations on Israel, including Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states and Egypt, will ensure the fulfilment of Ezekiel 38 and verse 13. You be the judge, brothers and sisters, of how close we are, because to the north of all that's going on there in the Middle East is a Russian bear. That was the Time magazine in the year that my oldest daughter was born, 1979. Isn't it amazing? Because the Russian bear is looking down on what they called 40 years ago the crescent of crisis. Even so come, Lord Jesus.